The decorations hit him like a fist to the chest. Harlan Hartwell stood in the doorway of his ranch house, one hand braced against the weathered frame, and stared at what had been done to his porch while he was out riding the south pasture. Pine boughs, dried wildflowers woven through the railing with a precision that looked almost architectural. A wreath of cedar and juniper hung where nothing had ever hung before, and tied to each post with strips of faded calico were clusters of dried rose hips so red they looked like drops of blood against the gray wood. There was even a lantern, lit and burning, set on the railing where the afternoon sun caught the glass and threw small prisms across the floorboards. He had not celebrated anything since the fire. Not Christmas. Not the anniversary of when his father had first driven a stake into this land and called it theirs. Not a single birthday or harvest or branding day. 7 years of a porch as bare as a swept grave, and now this. His jaw tightened until he felt the ache in his back teeth. He crossed the yard in 4 long strides, boots raising dust, and then stopped at the bottom step. His whole body had seized up in a way that had nothing to do with the cold November air rolling down off the Upsaroka foothills. He stood there at the base of those 3 steps looking up at everything she had done, and something in his chest cracked along an old seam that he had spent 7 years mortaring shut. "Who told you to do this?" The voice that came from inside the house was calm. That was the worst of it. "Nobody told me," Annie Atwood said, and then she appeared in the doorway behind him, wiping her hands on a cloth, her dark hair pinned but escaping in the wind the way it always did. "That is generally how decisions work when you make them yourself." Harlan turned. His eyes were the color of slate in winter, and right now they looked exactly that hard. "Take it down." She looked at him for a long moment. She did not flinch. She did not apologize. She tilted her head the way she did when she was deciding whether an argument was worth having, and then she said, very quietly, "No." The single syllable fell into the yard between them like a stone into still water, and the ripples of it were still moving when Harlan Hartwell, who had not sat down on this porch in 7 years, lowered himself onto the top step and put his face in his hands. He did not speak for a long time. Neither did she. She sat down 2 steps below him, close enough that her shoulder was near his knee, and she looked out at the land he had inherited and nearly lost and clawed back from ruin, and she said nothing at all, because she was smart enough to know that some silences should not be broken. That was how it started, or rather, that was where it arrived. The starting was somewhere else entirely. 6 weeks earlier, Harlan had driven his wagon into the dusty canyon of a main street that made up Copperton, Wyoming in the autumn of 1887, and he had not been looking for anything except 200 pounds of winter grain, a new coil of rope, and to get home before the early dark came down off the mountains. He had found Annie Atwood instead. She was standing in the street outside the land office, and she was holding a surveying theodolite on a tripod that she had set up herself, and she was arguing with 3 men simultaneously with the particular controlled fury of someone who has been correct for so long that being doubted has become a personal offense. Harlan pulled the wagon to a stop. He could not help it. The 3 men were large. One of them worked for Caleb Pruitt, the largest rancher in the county, which meant he had the confidence of borrowed authority. Another was the county assessor, a narrow, ink-stained man who kept pushing his spectacles up his nose as if the glasses were somehow responsible for the argument. The third was just large, in the way that sometimes large men are brought along to conversation simply because of their size. The large man said something Harlan could not hear from the wagon seat, and Annie Atwood set down her notebook, looked up from the theodolite, and said, clearly enough that even the horses could have understood it, "The section corner is 14 feet west of where your employer claims it is. I have triangulated from 3 fixed reference points using measurements I took at first light this morning. The instrument does not have an opinion about who owns this land, but the mathematics is perfectly clear, and the mathematics says your employer has been grazing his cattle on property that does not belong to him for at least 2 years. The assessor pushed his spectacles up. Miss, with respect, you are a licensed surveyor, Annie said, certified by the Wyoming Territorial Office in Cheyenne in April of this year. I have my papers in my saddlebag if you need to see them, though I will warn you that reading them will only confirm what I have already told you. Harlan found himself climbing down from the wagon without having decided to do so. The hired man from Porch ranch stepped closer to Annie, and that was the thing that put Harlan's boots moving across the street, though he also knew, in some clear and honest corner of his mind, that she probably did not need him. She was not backing up. What seems to be the trouble? Harlan said, planting himself at an angle that was deliberately conversational but geometrically positioned between Annie and the large man. The hired man turned, saw Harlan's shoulders, saw the expression on his face, and made a quiet recalculation. Ranch business, the man said. Nothing to do with you, Hartwell. Harlan did not look at the man. He looked at Annie, which surprised her, he could tell. You need anything? He asked her. She studied him for exactly the time it took to determine that he was not going to be trouble. What I need, she said, is for someone to hold this post while I take the final reading. My assistant fell ill this morning. He had expected her to ask for an escort, or for him to resolve the argument by being large and quiet in the direction of the hired men. He had not expected to be made immediately useful in a technical capacity. Tell me where you want it, he said. He held the leveling post exactly where and exactly how she directed, and he kept it perfectly still for 4 minutes while she looked through the theodolite and wrote numbers in her notebook with the efficiency of someone who has done this 100 times in worse conditions, because she had. She had done it on hillsides in rain. She had done it in June heat when the ground shimmered and the instrument had to be shaded with her own body. She had done it alone in the pre-dawn cold, because the light at first dawn was the most honest light for this kind of work. When she was done, she folded the notebook, looked at the assessor, and said, I will submit my formal report to the territorial office by the end of this week. If Porch's cattle are on the disputed section before the boundary markers are reset, I will note that as well. She began to collapse the tripod with practiced efficiency. The hired man said one more thing, something low and ugly, and Annie did not even turn to look at him, which was a kind of contempt so perfect and refined that Harlan almost smiled. He helped her load the instrument into its case, which was latched with a specific sequence she showed him once and he got right the first time, which made her glance at him sideways. You have a careful hand for a rancher, she said. You have a sharp tongue for a surveyor, he said. She looked at him again. Her eyes were a dark hazel that shifted toward green in full sunlight, and they were, he noticed, absolutely certain of themselves. Not arrogant, certain. There was a difference, and he recognized it because certainty was something he had once had himself, before the fire had burned it out of him along with everything else. Annie Atwood, she said, and extended her hand. Harlan Hartwell. He took it. Her grip was firm. Her palm had calluses from the tripod legs and the measuring chains. You staying in Copperton until the survey is complete. Then I go where the work is. She said it simply, without apology or explanation, the way he said he was riding north when he was riding north. It was not information offered for response. It was simply fact. He helped her secure the case to her horse and went back to his wagon and bought his grain and his rope and drove home to the Hartwell land, which was 2 hours south along a road that became a track that became almost nothing at the edge of his property. And he told himself the entire way that he was not thinking about dark hazel eyes that knew exactly what they were looking at. He did not do a particularly good job of convincing himself. The Porch situation was worse than Harlan had guessed from the street. He found out the details 2 days later when he rode into Copperton for a buckle that the blacksmith had been mending, and stopped at the land office where the assessor was now visibly agitated in a way that spectacle pushing alone could not contain. Caleb Prout was 60 years old and had been building his empire in Carbon County for 30 years by the simple method of taking what he wanted and then making the paperwork catch up later. He was not a violent man by reputation, but the men he employed were sometimes violent on his behalf, which he considered a useful distinction. He had grazed his herd across the southwest corner of the Hartwell land twice in the last year, and both times he had claimed the fence line was unclear. Harlan had replaced his fence line both times without speaking to Prout directly, because he was managing his temper carefully, and he knew that a direct confrontation with a man that powerful required leverage he did not yet have. Annie Atwood was leverage. Not that Harlan thought of her that way. Not at first. What he thought, when the assessor told him that Annie had filed her preliminary report, and that Prout was furious about it, was that someone needed to tell her to watch herself. Prout was not the kind of man who accepted the word mathematics gracefully. He found her at the livery, tending her horse. She was checking the animal's left foreleg with the focused attention of someone who had noticed something and was determining whether it was serious, and she did not look up when he came in because she was busy being competent. "How bad?" he said, nodding at the leg. "Soft swelling. She came down hard on some shale yesterday. It will be fine with 2 days' rest." She straightened and turned, and she was not surprised to see him, which either meant she had heard his boots on the stable floor or she was simply not a person who startled easily. He suspected both. "Prout filed a counter-complaint with the territorial office," she said before he could speak. "He claims my methodology was flawed." Was it? No, he believed her. He had seen her work. More importantly, he had seen the expression on her face when she was working, which was the expression of someone who does not guess because they do not have to. "He has men who will make things difficult," Harlan said. "Not directly, nothing you could point at, but difficult. Men have been making things difficult for me since I was the only woman in a surveying class at the Wyoming School of Mines in 1882, Annie said. "I am still surveying. They are not still making it difficult." He stood with that for a moment. "What happened to them?" he asked. She picked up a brush and began working on the horse's flank. 3 of them eventually accepted that I was better at the work than they were. 1 filed a complaint with the school, which the school dismissed. 1 left surveying altogether, which had nothing to do with me and everything to do with his own capabilities. She paused. "And 1 became my business partner for 2 years, until he moved to Colorado to get married." "So you beat 4 out of 5. "I beat all 5, she said. "The last one just had his own reasons for leaving." He almost smiled again. The almost smile was becoming a habit when she spoke. "My land is on the south line of the disputed section," he said. "Prout has been eating at my boundary for 2 years. If your survey holds, it cuts off his access to a water source he's been using without rights." She stopped brushing, turned. Those certain eyes assessed him. "And you want to know if I am going to be pressured into changing my numbers," she said. "I want to know if there is anything I can do to make sure that does not happen." She considered this. He could see her thinking, not in the meandering way some people thought out loud, but in the rapid, sequential way of someone moving through steps. "You could let me use your land as a base camp," she said. "I need to complete the southern measurements, and Prout's men have been following me at a distance whenever I ride out toward the disputed section. If I am working from your property, that changes the dynamic considerably." He had not expected that. He had expected her to say she did not need help, or to ask him to speak to Prout, or to tell him the matter was official and none of his business. He had not expected her to immediately identify the most strategically useful thing he could offer and ask for it without embarrassment. "My place is 2 hours south," he said. "It is not comfortable." "I have camped in snow," she said, "in November, in the Wind River Range." "I have a spare room," he said, which was true. He had several spare rooms, actually, because the house had been built for a family and now held only him. She agreed with the same practicality with which she approached everything, shook his hand again, and told him she would arrive the following Thursday with her equipment and her supplies. She asked nothing about the house or the land or him personally, which was the moment, though he did not realize it until much later that he began to fall for her. She arrived on Thursday as stated, which he had not fully believed would happen, because he had learned not to fully believe in things arriving as expected. She came down the track from the North Road with her horse and a pack animal and the theodolite case, and a roll of canvas that turned out to be a portable shelter for working in rain, and she did not need help unloading, though he helped anyway because he had been raised that way. She looked at the house from the yard. He watched her look at it. The house was large and old and needed paint, and the porch railing had a section that he had patched with mismatched wood 3 years ago and never gotten around to matching properly. The yard was swept clean because he was not a slovenly man, but there were no flowers, no ornaments, nothing decorative in any direction. Just the functional architecture of a working ranch, stripped of everything that was not necessary. Functional, she said. Yes, he said. She did not say anything else about it, and she put her things in the spare room he showed her, which had a good window and a solid floor. And that evening she sat at his table and ate the stew he had made without commenting on whether it was good or bad, and she spread her maps and notes across the other half of the table and worked until the lamp needed trimming, which she noticed and trimmed herself before he could offer. He watched her across the table. He was not obvious about it. She was cross-referencing her field notes against a territorial map that was, he could see from where he sat, not entirely accurate, and she was making small corrections in the margins with a very sharp pencil, and she was doing it with the absorption of someone who loves what they are doing even when what they are doing is tedious. "The fire," she said, without looking up. He went very still. "The neighbors in town mentioned it," she said. "I am not prying. I just want to know if there is anything about the property that I should account for in the survey, structures that no longer exist, that sort of thing." "The barn was there," he said, after a moment, pointing generally east. "Foreman's quarters, those are gone. How long ago? 7 years. She noted it in her margin, looked up. "Were you here when it happened?" "Yes." She looked at him for exactly long enough to understand that the answer to the next question she might have asked was no, and that no was the worst possible answer to that question, and she said very quietly, "I am sorry," and returned to her maps. He had not expected that either. He had expected either more questions or immediate withdrawal. She gave him neither. She gave him the most useful thing, which was the acknowledgement and then the space, and he sat with that for a while as the lamp burned and the wind moved against the windows, and he thought that she was a very unusual woman. Over the next week, she worked with a rigor that he found himself watching the way you watch someone do something you have never seen done well. She was up before dawn each morning, checking the temperature because it affected the instrument's calibration, writing the reading in a notebook before she did anything else. She ate quickly and without fuss. She was on horseback before the light was fully up, with a route planned and a purpose that did not waver. He had hired a seasonal hand, a young man named Orrin who was cheerful and not very bright, to help carry equipment and hold posts. On the third day, Orrin made the mistake of adjusting the tripod after Annie had leveled it, because he thought he was being helpful. She did not shout. She asked him, in a voice that was perfectly level and extremely clear, to explain what he had adjusted and why. And Orrin, who had no good answer to either question, stood there with his mouth open while she re-leveled the instrument and explained the physics of what he had disrupted in terms that were simple enough that even Harlan, listening from 20 yards away where he was checking the fence line, understood them entirely. After that, Orrin did exactly what he was told and nothing else, which was exactly what was needed. On the 5th day, Prute's man showed up, not the large one from the street, a different one older, with the careful eyes of someone paid to observe. He appeared on the ridge above the disputed section and watched Annie work for 2 hours without making any move toward her. Just watching. Annie noted his position in her field notebook, time of appearance, description, location relative to the survey markers. She did it without interrupting her measurements, and she did it with the steady efficiency of someone documenting evidence. Harlan had ridden up quietly after the first hour and positioned himself between the ridge and where Annie was working. He did not go up to the man. He just stood there on his own land, visible and patient. The man on the ridge left around noon. That evening, Annie showed Harlan the notebook entry. "If he comes back," she said, "it becomes a documented pattern, which is useful." "You are keeping a record of the interference," he said. "I keep records of everything," she said. "Accuracy is the only protection I have ever had that nobody can take away." He thought about that for a long time after she had gone to the spare room. He thought about what it meant to have learned, as she clearly had, that the only reliable defense was competence so thorough that no amount of bad faith could discredit it. He understood the logic. He also understood the loneliness underneath it, though he suspected she would not have called it loneliness herself. On the 7th day, she asked him to show her the east end of his property, which was the corner she needed to reference for the final measurements. They rode out together in the early morning, and for the first time since she had arrived, they were simply riding and talking without the work as the immediate focus. He told her about the eastern pasture and the spring that came up reliable even in dry years, and she told him about a survey she had done the previous spring in the Big Horn Basin, working for the Federal Land Office, which involved 3 weeks of rain, a dispute between two homesteaders that nearly became violent, and a mathematical error in an old government survey that had put a legal boundary in the middle of a creek for 40 years. "How did you fix it?" he asked. "With a great deal of patience and a letter to Washington that took 6 months to receive a reply," she said. "The reply was that we were correct and the old survey had been wrong, which we already knew, but having it in writing from Washington made everyone more comfortable. And the homesteaders, one of them moved," she said. "The other stayed and planted alfalfa and seemed very happy about it when I last heard." "Do you always wonder what happens to them after?" he asked. "After the survey is done and you move on?" She considered the question seriously, the way she did. "Sometimes," she said. "The work itself is the part I am present for. The before and the after belong to other people." They came over a rise, and the east corner of his land opened up below them, and it was beautiful in the cold November morning, the way only high country can be beautiful, with the frost on the grass catching the new sun and the mountains behind it all going from gray to blue to the pale gold of the peaks. She pulled her horse up beside his, and they sat there for a moment in a silence that was entirely different from all the other silences they had shared, warmer somehow, and more like choice. "It is a good piece of land," she said. "It was better," he said. She did not ask him to explain what he meant by that, but he told her anyway, which surprised him. "For the fire, my father's land and mine were together," he said. "He had the north section, I had this. We ran them like one operation, shared water rights, shared the grazing rotation. There were 5 of us working it then. My father, my mother, 2 hands who had been with us since I was young, and me." He paused. "The fire started in the barn, June, middle of the night. Nobody knows exactly how. The barn went and the foreman's quarters, and then the wind came up from the east and the house caught." He had not spoken these words in succession for years. They came out of him in a flat, measured tone, like something being reported rather than remembered. "Parents did not make it out," he said. "She did not say she was sorry a second time. She had already said that. What she said was, 'And then you were alone on this land.' For 7 years," he said, "and you kept it. It was a close thing a few times," he said. "The first winter was very bad. I took on debt to keep the herd, paid it back over 3 years, rebuilt what I could rebuild myself, hired out during the seasons I could afford a hand and worked alone during the ones I could not." "But you kept it," she said again, and something in the way she said it made it feel different from what he had thought it was. He had thought of the keeping as survivorship. She seemed to see it as something more active, an achievement earned rather than a tragedy outlasted. He looked at her on her horse in the morning light and felt something he had not felt in 7 years, which was the particular sensation of being seen accurately. They did the measurements at the east corner. She was quick and precise, and he watched her move through the steps of the work with the specific appreciation of someone who recognizes technical mastery, even in a field they do not know themselves. When she read the angles from the theodolite, she moved the telescope with a touch so delicate it looked like she was handling something fragile, though the instrument was robust and designed for rougher handling. It was that she was so exactly certain of where she needed to look that she never needed force. On the way back, she said, "I want to tell you something that may be difficult to hear." He braced himself. "Prout's encroachment is more significant than anyone currently knows," she said. "The boundary he has been treating as his own is not 14 feet off. Once I complete the south measurement, I believe it will be closer to 40 feet. Over the full length of the disputed line, that is a substantial amount of acreage, including your spring." He turned to look at her. "He has been using your spring," she said. "Legally, it has been yours the entire time, and he has never had any rights to it. If my numbers hold, and they will, he owes you 2 years of water access fees and the cost of any damage his cattle have done to your land." Harlan thought about this. "He is going to fight it," he said. "He is going to try," she said. "That is why my documentation needs to be perfect, and it will be." "I know it will be," he said, and he said it without hesitation, which made her look at him in that sideways way she had, the one where she was reassessing something she had already assessed. "You trust my work," she said. "I watched you work," he said. "Yes." A pause. "Most men don't," she said. It was not a complaint. It was an observation. "Most men haven't watched you work," he said. She was quiet for the rest of the ride, but it was a thoughtful quiet, not a closed one. And when they got back to the ranch, she took the horses to the stable herself, which she always did, and which he had stopped offering to do for her after the first day, because she was clear that she preferred to do it herself. She completed the southern measurements on a Tuesday, in a light that had gone white and cold with the first suggestion of real winter coming down from the north. Harlan rode out with her and held posts and carried equipment and said very little, because this was the final and most critical measurement, and she was in the deep focused state that he had come to recognize, where speaking to her was like speaking to someone in the middle of a calculation. When she finally stepped back from the theodolite and looked at the numbers in her notebook, and then at the numbers again, and then nodded once to herself, he let out a breath he had not noticed he was holding. 43 feet, she said. At the south line, he encroached 43 feet, and yes, it crosses your spring. She looked up at him then, and there was something in her face that was different. Not just professional satisfaction, though that was there too. Something that had to do with him specifically, with the fact that this number meant something particular to the man who had stood beside her for 2 weeks of cold early mornings holding posts and carrying chain and never once asking when she would be finished. "This is going to be difficult for Prout," she said. "Good," Harlan said simply. She laughed. He had not heard her laugh before, properly. It was brief and genuine, and it changed her face entirely, opening something up that was usually held in reserve, and he thought, with a clarity that was both sudden and not at all surprising, that he was in serious trouble. The report went to the territorial office at the end of the week. Annie made 3 copies herself, in her precise handwriting, and kept one, sent one to Cheyenne, and filed one with the county assessor, who pushed his spectacles up repeatedly while receiving it. Prout's response came within 3 days, which was faster than anything official ever moved in Carbon County, which told Harlan that Prout had already been preparing his counterargument. The counterargument was that Annie's license was improperly issued, which was false, and that her methodology was non-standard, which was also false and which she could document in detail, and that her measurements conflicted with a previous survey, which was true because the previous survey had been done in 1871 by a man who had not accounted for magnetic declination properly and whose work had been questioned twice in the intervening years. Annie sat at Harlan's table that evening with all of this spread before her, and she was not visibly upset, which told him she had anticipated it. "He hired someone," she said. "What kind of someone?" "A surveyor from Laramie who has worked for Prout twice before." She tapped one of the documents with her finger. This counter-survey references measurements that I do not believe were actually taken. The angles are too neat. Real field measurements always have irregularities because the land has irregularities. These numbers look like someone sat in an office and worked backward from the conclusion. Can you prove that? I can make it very difficult to prove otherwise, she said. I have 4 reference points I measured independently. If the counter-survey is challenged, the reference points will be compared, and mine will match the physical markers and his will not, because I actually stood at those markers and he did not. She said it quietly but with a certainty so complete it was almost frightening. What do you need? He asked. I need someone to go to Laramie, she said. To the licensing office there. The surveyor's name is Hodges. I want to know whether Hodges was actually in the field anywhere near Carbon County in the window when this counter-survey would have had to be done, because field surveys require travel logs and I want to see his. Harlan looked at her. You want me to go to Laramie? I want someone trustworthy to go to Laramie, she said. I need to stay here and prepare my defense of the original survey. He was on the road to Laramie the next morning. It was a 3-day ride, hard in the November cold, and he did it without complaint and without telling her what he was thinking about for most of those 3 days, which was her hands on the theodolite and the sound of her laugh, and the way she had said his name, the few times she had said it, with a kind of directness that felt like respect. In Laramie, he went to the licensing office and presented himself as an interested party in a survey dispute, which was accurate, and asked to see the travel documentation for the surveyor Hodges for the month of October. The licensing officer was a tired man near the end of his career who either could not imagine why he should withhold the information or did not care enough to try, because he brought out the log without much resistance. Hodges had been in Casper in October, all of October. He had surveyed a mining claim on the north side of the Platte for a client whose name Harlan recognized as a business associate of Pruitt's. He was not in Carbon County. He could not have done field measurements that the counter-survey claimed were done in October. The counter-survey was fabricated. Harlan copied down what he needed and rode back in 2 days instead of 3, pushing the horse a little more than was comfortable, and stopping himself from examining too closely why he was in such a hurry. He arrived back at the ranch at dusk on the 2nd day, cold and stiff from the saddle, and Annie came out of the house when she heard the hooves, which meant she had been listening for him, and he chose not to say anything about that. He showed her the notes. She read them once, then again, then set them on the table and looked at him. You rode hard, she said. Roads were good, he said. Harlan, he looked up. Thank you, she said, and it had more in it than those 2 words usually carry. It had the weight of someone who has learned not to rely on other people and finds it genuinely startling when someone proves reliable. He did not know what to do with the expression on her face, so he went to the stove and started coffee, and she sat down with the notes and began writing, and the kitchen was warm against the cold outside and the lamp made everything inside it golden, and it was the most settled Harlan Hartwell had felt in 7 years. He should have said something then. He knew it even at the time. But the habit of silence on certain subjects was deep in him, carved deep by years of having no one to speak those subjects to, and he poured the coffee and said nothing, and she wrote, and the fire crackled in the stove, and the night pressed against the windows, and it was nearly enough. Nearly. The hearing before the county magistrate was set for the 2nd week of November. In the days before it, 3 things happened. The first was that Pruitt's hired man, the older careful-eyed one, came to the ranch. Harlan saw him coming down the track from half a mile out and was standing in the yard when he arrived. The man pulled up his horse and looked at Harlan and said that Mr. Pruitt would like to resolve this matter without the involvement of the territorial office and had a proposal he would like Miss Atwood to consider. Miss Atwood will receive correspondence through the county land office, Harlan said. If Mr. Pruitt has a proposal, he can put it in writing. Mr. Pruitt would prefer to speak directly, the man said. I imagine he would, Harlan said. Miss Atwood sees no need for that. You are speaking for her now, the man said with an edge on it. No, Harlan said. She said as much herself this morning when we discussed whether Mr. Prout might send someone around. She was very clear. He had, in fact, discussed exactly this with Annie over breakfast, and she had said those exact words, that she saw no need for a direct conversation with Prout, because she had nothing to discuss with him that was not already documented, and that any attempt to pressure her outside official channels should be noted and reported. She had asked Harlan to relay this if anyone came calling, which he now did. The man looked at him for a long moment, doing the kind of calculation that men in his position did when they were trying to determine whether a situation had potential. Then he turned his horse and rode back the way he had come. The second thing that happened was that Annie found something in the original 1871 survey records that the territorial office kept copies of, which she had written to Cheyenne to obtain, and which arrived by mail 3 days before the hearing. The 1871 survey had a note in the margin, in the original surveyor's handwriting, acknowledging a possible error in the magnetic declination calculation and flagging it for future correction. The correction had never been made. The flagged error was exactly what Annie's corrected survey accounted for. She brought the document to Harlan that evening with an expression that was the closest to triumphant he had seen on her face. He knew, she said. The original surveyor knew his measurement might be wrong, and he noted it, and nobody followed up on it for 16 years. This ends the challenge, Harlan said. This ends the challenge, she agreed. She stood across the table from him, holding the old paper in both hands, and she was flushed with the clean excitement of having been right in a way that was now irrefutable. And Harlan looked at her and felt something in his chest that was so large and so unfamiliar he could not immediately identify it, and then could, and then stood very still with the identifying of it. He was in love with her. He was entirely, irrevocably in love with a woman who had told him on the first day that she went where the work was, who had never once indicated that this particular piece of Wyoming was a place she intended to stay, who had come to his ranch for the practical purpose of access and documentation and would leave when the work was complete. "You will present this at the hearing," he said. "Yes," she said, and then she looked at him more carefully because she was not a woman who missed things. "Is something wrong?" "No," he said. "It is very good news." She watched him for another moment, then nodded and took the document carefully back to her room. The third thing that happened was that he went out to the barn that night late, when the house was dark and quiet, and stood in the cold among the smell of horses and hay, and he talked to the barn the way he sometimes talked to things that could not answer, because talking to things that could not answer was safer than talking to the things that could. He told the barn that she was leaving after the hearing. That was the fact of the situation. She had never said otherwise. She was a licensed surveyor who traveled to where the work was, and the work here would be done. He told the barn that it had been a very long time since he had let himself care about anything that could leave or be lost, and that he had been good at that, had been very carefully and methodically good at that, and that it had taken Annie Atwood 11 days to dismantle 11 years of careful management, and he was not sure whether to be furious or grateful. He stood there until the cold got into his bones, and then he went inside and went to bed and did not sleep very well. The hearing was held in the courthouse in Copperton on a Thursday morning with the county magistrate presiding and a representative from the Territorial Land Office present, which Annie had specifically requested and which had required another letter to Cheyenne. Prout was there. Harlan had not seen him up close before. He was a big man gone soft with prosperity, with the specific authority of someone who has been agreed with so often he has forgotten it is possible not to be. He had a lawyer from Casper and the surveyor Hodges, who sat to one side looking uncomfortable. Annie presented her case with a composure that Harlan, sitting in the back of the room, found almost painful to watch because it was so good. She laid out the methodology first, precisely and without jargon beyond what the magistrate could follow with a brief explanation. She presented her reference points and their physical locations. She presented the original survey's marginal note, which she had professionally copied so the original could remain with the territorial office. She presented Harlan's documentation from the Laramie licensing office, which she introduced as evidence of the counter-survey's impossibility. Then she put up her maps. They were detailed and exact, and she had added elevations and water features, and the spring on Harlan's east boundary was marked clearly, and the 43-foot encroachment line was drawn in red, and it crossed the spring unambiguously. Pruitt's lawyer made his arguments. They were good arguments, well constructed, but they were arguments against a survey that was accurate. And accuracy has a particular quality in a room where documents and instruments are being discussed. It is very hard to dislodge with rhetoric alone. When Hodges took the stand and was asked about his October travel, he looked at the licensing log documentation that Annie's counsel introduced and went the color of old dough. The magistrate took 2 hours. He found for Annie's survey. He found the encroachment. He ordered Pruitt to remove his cattle from the disputed area, to reset his fences to the corrected boundary, and to compensate the Hartwell land for 2 years of unauthorized water access. The amount was not enormous, but it was real money, and more importantly, it was the first time in 30 years that Caleb Pruitt had been formally ruled against in a land matter in Carbon County, and every person in that courtroom knew it. Annie shook the magistrate's hand and the territorial representative's hand and thanked her counsel, and turned around and looked for Harlan, and found him standing at the back of the room with an expression that he was making no effort to control because he had simply forgotten to. She walked toward him. She was carrying her document case and her notes and the maps, and she was calm and complete in her victory the way she was calm and complete in her work, with no excess, nothing performed for an audience. "Well," she said. "Well," he said. They stood there looking at each other in the emptying courthouse, and then she said, "I need to write the final report, and I need to submit my invoice to the land office, and I should send a letter to the client who hired me originally." "How long will that take?" he said. She thought. 3 days, perhaps 4. 4 days. He had 4 days to figure out what to say to her, or to figure out whether saying anything was right, or to figure out how to let her go without saying anything, and whether he was capable of doing that. He was not, he decided. He was not capable of it. She wrote her report at his table over the next 3 days. He cooked meals and brought coffee and read by the fire and went about the work of the ranch, which had stacked up in the weeks of the hearing preparations. And the 4th day, he found himself awake before dawn, lying in the dark looking at the ceiling and thinking clearly for the first time in weeks. He was going to tell her. He was going to do it plainly and without manipulation, because she was a woman who valued plain and accurate things, and the plainest and most accurate thing he knew how to say was that he did not want her to leave. He had not told anyone he did not want them to leave since the fire. He had never had the chance. He got up. He made coffee. He sat at the table in the gray pre-dawn and waited for her to come out of the spare room. She came out at her usual time before full light, and she was already dressed for work in her practical dark skirt and the heavy jacket she wore against the morning cold, and she stopped when she saw him sitting there already. "You are up early," she said. "I could not sleep," he said. "Annie." She heard something in the way he said her name. She sat down across from him without coffee, just sat down with her full attention, which was the most focused attention he had ever been the target of. "I have something to say," he said, "and I do not want to say it badly." "Then take your time," she said quietly. He did. He took a moment and then he said, "In 11 days you have done things in my kitchen and at my table and across my land that have made this ranch feel like a place where something is happening. Not just being maintained, something happening. I did not know how to want that again after the fire. I thought wanting things here was finished." He paused. "I do not want you to go when the report is done. I know that is not a plan, and it is not something I have any right to expect, but it is what is true, and you are someone who deserves the truth even when it is inconvenient." She was very still across the table. "You are asking me to stay," she said. "I am telling you that I want you to stay," he said. "Those are different things. I am not asking for anything." She looked at him for a long time, long enough that he felt the particular pain of waiting for a thing you have finally said out loud, the exposure of it. "I have not stayed anywhere in 4 years," she said. "I go where the work is." "I know." "I don't know how to stay," she said, and it was the most honestly uncertain thing she had ever said to him, the first crack he had seen in the competence, not a weakness but a true admission. "I don't know how to let anyone stay," he said, "so we are evenly matched." Something shifted in her face. The smallest possible smile. "That is a very logical argument," she said. "You like logical arguments," he said. "I do," she admitted. She was quiet for a moment more, and then she said, "I will submit the report, and then I will come back if you still want me to, after I have had time to think about it properly." "I will still want you to," he said. She nodded once, deliberately. And then she got up and got herself coffee and sat back down and opened her notes, and the morning came up outside the windows, and the world continued, and Harlan Hartwell felt something loosen in his chest that had been clenched for 7 years. She was gone for 3 weeks. He went about the work of the ranch, and he did not decorate the porch or make the house look like anything was expected, because he was not going to do that to himself, not going to build the expectation into the physical world where he would have to look at it if she did not come back. He repaired the mismatched section of porch railing. He chopped a great deal of firewood. He rode the fence lines and checked the spring, which was his spring now in a way that had been formally established, and he stood beside it in the cold, clear December light and thought that things could be better than they had been. She came back on a Thursday. He saw her coming down the track, and he was in the yard before he had decided to go to the yard, and she came across the frozen ground on the horse he had seen her on from the first day, and she stopped and looked at him from horseback. "I thought about it," she said. And he said, "I would like to see if I can learn to stay," she said. "I make no promises about how well I will do it." "Neither do I," he said, "but I would like to find out." She dismounted, and he took her horse's reins, and she stood in his yard in the December cold with her document case and her saddlebags, and she looked at the house and the land, and she nodded once, the way she nodded when she had confirmed a measurement was right. The days that followed were careful and new, both of them learning a thing neither had much practice with, which was being present in a particular place with a particular person without a defined professional purpose to organize the hours. She wrote up the remainder of her professional correspondence from his table. She had 2 other survey contracts she had been asked to quote, and she wrote the quotes and sent them and told him straightforwardly that if the contracts came through she would need to do the field work, which would mean time away. She asked if that was something he could understand. He said yes and meant it, because he had spent years alone on this land and knew how to do it, and because wanting her to stay did not mean wanting to clip her. She knew that. She had known it before she asked. But she had asked anyway, because she valued explicit agreement over assumed understanding, which he was coming to see was simply how she thought about important things. The contracts came through in January. One was in the Big Horn Basin, a week's work. The other was south, near the Colorado border, 2 weeks. She went to both and came back from both, and each time she came back a little more fully, the way someone learns to trust a structure by testing it and finding it holds. He watched her settle. He did not rush it. He repaired the north fence and built a proper shelter for the pack animal she had brought with her survey equipment, which she had begun to keep at his ranch as a matter of practical convenience, and which he thought of privately as the first material stake she had put in this place. In February, she moved the remainder of her professional materials from the boarding house in Copperton, where she had been keeping them between contracts, because the boarding house was costing money and she needed the storage, she said, which was practical and accurate and also clearly not the whole reason. He did not say that. He helped her bring the cases and rolls of maps and the carefully packed instrument and the boxes of notebooks that represented years of field work, and he cleared a room for them and helped her set up a proper work table with good light, and she stood in the finished room and looked around it and looked at him and said, "This is very good, Harlan." And the way she said his name then was entirely different from any of the previous ways. He kissed her in the doorway of the room she had just organized. He had been thinking about it for long enough that when he did it, it was more deliberate than impulsive, which she seemed to appreciate, because she kissed him back with a matching deliberateness that told him she had been thinking about it too. She was warm and direct and certain even in this, the way she was certain in everything she did, and when they separated she looked at him with those hazel eyes that saw accurately and she said, "I am going to need you to be patient with me." "I have been patient for 7 years," he said. "I can manage more." "That is also a very logical argument," she said. "I know you like them," he said, and she laughed again, that brief real laugh that opened something in her face, and he thought he could spend a considerable number of years trying to find the things that made her laugh like that. Spring came to the Hartwell land with the particular violence that high country spring has, cold one day and blazing the next, the snowmelt running loud in the creek, the mud making the track nearly impassable for 2 weeks in March. Annie was in the field for most of March, working a surveying contract south of Casper, and Harlan spent the time getting the land ready for the season and not thinking about her absence, which he did with middling success. She came back in early April with dried grass in her hair and sunburn on the bridge of her nose and stories about a dispute between 2 cattlemen that had nearly required federal mediation, and she sat at his table and ate a proper meal and talked without her usual reserve about all of it, and he listened and refilled her coffee and thought that this specifically, was what he had been missing for the years of silence. In April he asked her to marry him. He did it in the morning, before coffee, which was perhaps not strategically ideal, but it was when it needed to be said. He sat across from her at the table and said, "I want to ask you something, and I want you to know that my expectation is not a yes immediately, or at all if it is not the right thing, but I want to ask." She looked at him carefully. "Ask. Will you marry me?" he said. "Will you make this place yours and let me make whatever you need here for your work and your life? I'm not asking you to stop going where the work is. I am asking if you will come back here when you are done going." She was quiet for what felt like a very long time. "You are asking me to have a home," she said. "Yes," he said. She had not had a home, he had come to understand over the months. She had had a series of boarding houses and tents and borrowed rooms, and she had been so fiercely independent and so completely competent that she had sometimes confused the two, the ability to be alone and the choosing to be alone. They were not the same thing. "Yes," she said, simply, cleanly, the way she said yes to things that were correct. "Yes, Harlan." He reached across the table and took her hand and held it, and neither of them said anything for a moment. And the spring morning was loud outside with birds and creek water, and the specific aliveness of a season turning. They were married in Copperton in May of 1888. The ceremony was performed by the circuit minister who came through every 6 weeks, and was attended by the county assessor, who was pleased, and by Orrin, who was cheerful, and by a woman named Marguerite who ran the dry goods store and who had been kind to Annie the first time she came to town, and by 3 other ranchers who had cause to like Harlan Hartwell and came to wish him well. Prute was not invited and did not attend, which was correct. Annie wore a dress that was not her working dress, in a deep blue that made her eyes go fully green, and she wore her hair pinned up with less escaping than usual, which she had achieved through what she described as an unreasonable amount of effort. Harlan wore his good jacket and a fresh shave, and when she came into the room and found him already there, he looked at her for long enough that she tilted her head and said, "Is something wrong with the dress?" "Absolutely nothing is wrong with the dress," he said. She looked at him a moment longer and then she smiled, not the brief real laugh smile but a quieter one, the one he had been learning to recognize as what she looked like when she was genuinely happy. He stored it in a careful place. After the ceremony, they rode home to the ranch. The track was dry now, and the land was green with new grass, and the mountains to the north still had snow on the peaks, but the lower country was alive and bright. She rode beside him and they talked about the season and the herd and a contract she had been asked to take in June, and it was ordinary in the best possible sense of that word. The summer was full. Annie took the June contract and came back in 3 weeks, sunburned and satisfied, and with a commission from the territorial office for additional boundary work that would keep her busy through the fall. She set up her work table in the room Harlan had cleared for her and spread her maps and notebooks, and the work expanded through the season the way work does when you are good at it. Harlan hired a full-time hand, a steady man named Beaumont who had worked ranches across Wyoming and Montana, and who had the useful quality of keeping his own counsel and getting things done without needing to be told twice. With Beaumont handling much of the daily labor, Harlan found time he had not had before, and he used it to repair the rest of the things that had needed repairing for years, to build a proper privy closer to the house, to replace the kitchen stove with one that had a proper oven, which Annie had never complained about not having and was visibly pleased to have. She came in from a day of field work in August to find the new stove installed and looked at it and then at him and said, "When did you have time for that?" "Beaumont helped," he said. She ran her hand along the top of it. "It has an oven." "It does." "I could learn to bake," she said, not as if she was going to immediately learn to bake, but as if the option was interesting. He said nothing and she turned and kissed him on the cheek with a warmth that surprised them both by its ease, the casualness of it, the way affection between two people who have been careful with each other becomes eventually careless in the best sense, habitual and natural. It was in late September, the air getting its first real edge of cold, that Annie bought the decorations. Harlan did not know about it because she did it on a trip to Copperton to file a survey at the land office, and she bought the pine boughs and the dried wildflowers and the calico strips and the rose hips and the lantern at the dry goods store from Marguerite, who loaded everything with evident enthusiasm and asked no questions beyond the practical ones about what kind of ties Annie wanted for the cedar clusters. She came home in the late afternoon, and Harlan was still out on the south pasture checking the fence line before winter, which she knew because she had asked Beaumont, who told her without curiosity. She spent an hour on the porch. She had thought about the fire. She had thought about what it meant to him, the bare porch, the undecorated house, the way he let nothing accumulate that was not functional because functional things could be rebuilt if they were lost and beautiful things could not. She understood the logic. She also understood that logic taken too far in that direction becomes its own kind of damage, the damage of preventative grief, of refusing to love anything that could burn. She worked carefully, the way she did everything. She distributed the greenery evenly. She tied the rose hips so they moved in the wind but did not come loose. She tested the lantern and set it where it caught the afternoon light. She stepped back and looked at it. It was not extravagant. It was not even, by the standards of most homes she had been in, particularly elaborate. It was a porch that looked like someone lived there and was not afraid to let that be visible. She heard his horse come into the yard below the rise and she went inside because she needed to know what he would do when he saw it without her there, before his expression had time to arrange itself for her benefit. She heard him stop at the bottom of the steps. She heard him say, "Who told you to do this?" She came to the doorway, wiping her hands on a cloth. She said what she said. He said what he said. She said no, and watched the word land in him the way she had known it would, not as defiance but as the thing it actually was, which was a refusal to let him remain inside the walls he had built. Then Harlan Hartwell sat down on the top step of his porch. She sat down 2 steps below him, close enough that her shoulder was near his knee, and she looked out at the land he had kept and she waited, because she knew how to wait with precision, and she knew that this particular silence required it. After a very long time he said, "My mother decorated the porch for harvest, every year." "I know," she said. She had figured that out herself, the same way she figured most things out by looking at the evidence and following where it led. "I thought if I left it bare," he stopped, started again, as if keeping it bare was a kind of faithfulness, she said, to them. Yes, the word came out of him rough. Harlan, she said gently, they would not have wanted you to keep a bare porch. He was quiet. They would have wanted someone to decorate it, she said, even if it was not them doing it. He put his hands on his knees and looked out at the land, and she could feel something moving through him the way she could feel weather moving across open country, the kind of movement that changes the atmosphere afterward. It is a good porch, he said finally. It is, she said. The rosehips were my mother's favorite thing, he said. She dried them for tea, and she hung them from everything in November. Annie had not known that when she bought them. She had bought them because they were red against the gray wood. She thought about saying so and decided not to, because some things are better left in the category of things that simply happen to be right. It is November, she said. It is, he said. He reached down and put his hand on her shoulder, and she put her hand over his, and they sat there on the steps of the porch she had decorated without permission as the light went from gold to amber to the deep blue of early evening, and the lantern lit the porch in its small, warm radius, and the mountains to the north went dark, and the Hartwell land settled into the night around them. He helped her add to it the next day. She had not asked him to. He simply came out in the morning with an armful of cedar branches from the stand on the east side of the property, the old stand his mother had cut from every year, and he put them in the gaps between the pine boughs with a care that told her he was remembering something while he did it. Then he cut the cedar small and showed her how his mother had tied it, differently from how Annie had tied the pine boughs, a specific knot that was his mother's particular way. She learned the knot in 2 tries. You have a good hand, he said. You told me that before, she said. It keeps being true, he said. She looked at him over her shoulder from where she was crouching at the railing, and he was looking at her with an expression she had seen a few times now and still found entirely leveling, which was that he was not performing the looking. He was just looking, seeing what was there. When is your birthday, she asked. He blinked. February the 11th. And your parents, he had to think about it. The dates felt rusty. My father was March, my mother was September. September is past, she said. But we can observe it next year. He understood what she was doing. She was not asking permission. She was not being diplomatic. She was establishing a calendar of observed things, building back the structure of a year that marks itself, that has particular days that mean something particular, that accumulates the weight of being lived. My mother's birthday was September 3rd, he said. September 3rd, she repeated and filed it. He sat down on the step he had sat on the evening before, the top one, and watched her finish the cedar and stand back to look at her work. The porch was fully done now. It looked like a home that had someone in it who intended to be there. Annie, he said. Yes, she said, not turning yet. Thank you, he said, for not taking it down when I asked. She turned then. The morning light was at her back, and her face was in the shadow of the porch roof, and her eyes were the dark hazel they went in shade, not the green, and she looked at him with the certainty that had never once wavered in all the time he had known her. You did not really want me to, she said. No, he said. I did not. She came and sat beside him on the top step, which was new, the same step, close enough that their arms were touching, and they sat together on the decorated porch in the November morning, and it was the most specific thing he had felt since the fire, the most located, the most present. Not the pain of remembering, but the aliveness of being here now, with this person in this light. He put his arm around her and she leaned into him, and they were both quiet, looking at the land. In the winter of 1888 into 1889, something happened that Harlan had not allowed himself to expect. Annie told him in January, in the same careful, direct way she told him everything, sitting across the table with her hands flat on the surface and her eyes on his. I am going to have a child, she said. In the summer, I am certain about the timing, and I am in good health. He did not say anything for a moment. He could not. The thing she was telling him was too large for the room. Harlan, she said, and he heard the first thread of uncertainty in her voice, not much, just enough. I am here, he said. I am right here, He stopped, put his own hands flat on the table. "I am very glad," he said, and it was the most inadequate sentence for the feeling it was supposed to carry, but she saw through to what was under it because she always did. "So am I," she said. "I think." "You think," he said. "I am not someone who has thought about children much," she said. "I have not had occasion to, but I am not afraid of it." "Of course you are not," he said, and he laughed, the first real laugh in a long time, and she looked at him with her small, genuine smile, and the warmth in the kitchen was very good that morning. She scaled back the contract work through the spring, staying closer to home, doing local surveys and correspondence work from the ranch. She continued to be herself, which is to say, she continued to be entirely competent and entirely certain, and not particularly inclined to be treated as fragile, which Harlan navigated carefully because he wanted to take care of her, and also understood that she required taking care of in ways that did not look like conventional coddling. He brought her coffee exactly how she liked it. He made sure Beaumont handled the heavier physical work of the ranch so Harlan could be around the house more. He read to her in the evenings from the books she kept on a shelf in her workroom, not because she could not read herself, but because she liked the sound of his voice reading, and had admitted this to him once with the smallest possible embarrassment, which he had found entirely endearing. The baby came in July. It was a long day, and Harlan spent most of it outside, because that was where the midwife told him to be, which he accepted with the compliance of someone who is genuinely terrified and managing it by being obedient. He repaired things that did not need repairing. He checked on the horses 4 times. He talked to Beaumont about nothing in particular, and Beaumont was solid and calm about it in the way he was solid and calm about everything. When the midwife came out to him in the late afternoon, her expression was tired but settled. "Your wife and your son are well," she said. He had to sit down on the porch steps to receive this information. His son. He went inside, and Annie was in the bed with her hair damp and loose around her, and she looked tired in the specific way of someone who has done an enormous amount of work and knows it. And she was looking at the child in her arms with an expression that was entirely new, not the certainty or the focused attention, but something more fundamental than either, something that had nothing to do with being capable. "He is very loud," she said, which was the first thing she said to Harlan, and the baby was demonstrating this accurately. "He has your lungs," Harlan said. "He has your hands," she said. "Look." He looked. He sat on the edge of the bed and he looked at his son, and the whole of 7 years and 11 years and the fire and the bare porch and the careful management of not wanting things that could be lost simply collapsed into this, the weight of the child in Annie's arms, the proof of something new. They named him William. William James Hartwell. William for Harlan's father and James for no one in particular, because it was a good name and it went well with the others. William was, from his first weeks, both vocal and perceptive, which Annie said were Hartwell qualities and Harlan said were Atwood qualities, and this argument was never resolved. The next years settled into the shape of something that Harlan had stopped believing was possible, and Annie had stopped believing she wanted, both of them wrong, both of them glad to be. Annie worked through the seasons with a schedule that accommodated William, and then, 3 years later, accommodated Clara, who came in the spring of 1892 with considerably less drama than her brother, and immediately set about being the most observant baby Harlan had ever seen, watching everything with her mother's eyes. Annie's survey practice grew. She was, by the early 1890s, one of the most well-regarded surveyors in the Wyoming territory, requested specifically for dispute work because of the Porch case and the cases that followed it, which she documented with the same thorough accuracy as the first. The territorial office asked her to serve on a review board for land disputes in 1893, which required trips to Cheyenne 3 times a year, and she went and Harlan managed, and Beaumont helped, and William, who was by then old enough to have opinions, held strong views about what Beaumont was allowed to do with his mother's work table. Porch sold his ranch in 1891 and moved to Colorado. Nobody in Carbon County was particularly sorry about it. The spring survey of 1892 found the Hartwell boundaries properly and permanently marked, with Annie's name on the official survey filed with the territorial office. The spring on the east side was legally and unambiguously the Hartwell Spring, and had been used without complication since the magistrate's ruling. Annie had walked the boundaries with William on her back in 1890, pointing at each marker and explaining to an 18-month-old what a reference point was, which William clearly did not understand but attended to with serious focus. "He is going to be a surveyor," Harlan said, watching this. "He is going to be whatever he wants to be," Annie said, "but the aptitude would not hurt." Every November, Annie decorated the porch. She had turned it into a specific ritual, adding something new each year while keeping the things that had become established. The rose hips were always there, the cedar knots tied in his mother's way. After the second year, she added a small wreath that William eventually learned to help with, and a garland along the railing that she made in the evenings by firelight in October, sorting dried flowers with the same deliberate care she brought to everything. Harlan stopped asking her to take it down after the first time. He started helping after the second year. By the fourth year, he had begun cutting the cedar on the 1st of November without being asked, because it was November and that was what November meant now. And Annie came out to find the branches already stacked on the porch and said nothing about it except to start sorting them by size, which was how it was done. On the 5th November, he stood back and looked at what they had made together of the porch, and felt something that he had no exact word for, something that had the texture of grief because it was touching the places where grief had lived for so long, but which was not grief, which was closer to its opposite. "She would have liked you," he said. Annie was straightening the wreath and she paused. "Your mother?" "Yes," she considered this. "Why?" "Because you do not pretend," he said. She hated pretending. She said it was the only thing she had no patience for. "She sounds very sensible," Annie said. "She was," he said. "She was remarkable." Annie came and stood beside him looking at the porch. "Tell me about her," she said. "I want to know her." So he told her. Standing on the porch in the November cold with the rose hips and the cedar and the lit lantern, he told her about his mother, who had come west from Ohio as a girl of 19 on a wagon that lost 2 wheels and arrived 3 weeks late and never complained about a single day of it, who had learned to ride a horse in her 20s because she needed to check the fence lines, and waiting for his father to do it was inefficient, who had kept a garden in soil that barely supported it and produced, against all reasonable expectation, tomatoes and green beans, and the most reliable stand of rose hips in the county. He told her about his father, who was a quiet man with enormous hands and great patience, who had driven the first stake into this ground, and believed with complete seriousness that the land would be kind to people who were straight with it. He told her about the 2 hands, older men who had worked with his father for years, and who had lived in the foreman's quarters that burned, and whose names were Merritt and Caldwell, and who deserved to be named because they had given years to this place. He told her all of it, standing in the November evening, and Annie listened with her full attention, which was the most complete attention he had ever been given, and the telling of it felt like the porch itself, like something that had been bare for too long and was finally, carefully, being covered in the things it was meant to hold. Clara started walking in the summer of 1893 and immediately demonstrated the quality that would define her, which was that she went directly toward things without hesitation and without fear. She walked into the horses' stalls and walked to the edge of the creek and walked into every room of the house as if auditing it, and nothing seemed to surprise her, which her parents found both reassuring and slightly alarming. William, at nearly 4, developed a passionate interest in the surveying instruments that Annie kept in her workroom, particularly the theodolite, and Annie taught him, with complete seriousness, how to look through the telescope and what he was seeing when he did. He looked and reported what he saw with the focused gravity of a small person who feels trusted, which he was. Harlan watched this from the door of the workroom and felt the full weight of what had been built here in this house on this land, with the decorated porch and the cedar knots in the spring that was theirs. "Is it accurate?" William asked his mother, peering through the telescope. "It is only accurate if you are looking at the right thing," Annie said. "First tell me what you are looking at." "The fence post," William said. "The far one." "Good," she said. "Now tell me if it is in the center of the view." "Almost," William said. "Almost is not enough," she said. "Not in surveying, adjust it." "She teaches him the same way she taught me," Harlan said from the door. Annie looked up. "You were an excellent student," she said. "For a rancher. You have always had very high standards," he said. "They have served me well," she said, and looked at him with those eyes that were certain and warm at once, and he crossed the room and kissed her on the temple while William remained absorbed in the telescope, and Clara, from her blanket on the floor, watched all of this with the attentive dark eyes that were going to see a great deal in her life. In 1894, the Territorial Office asked Annie to lead a commission on the standardization of surveying practices in Wyoming, which was an extraordinary appointment that recognized her specifically by name and acknowledged her decade of work in the territory. She brought it to Harlan at the table one evening the way she brought him everything important, directly, with all the information laid out. "It would require time in Cheyenne," she said. "6 months, perhaps 8, not all at once. But significant time. Then we will manage the significant time," he said. "William is old enough to be useful and Beaumont is solid. I would want to bring the children for parts of it," she said. "They should see Cheyenne. They should see everything," he said. "Within reason," she smiled. "You are a very reasonable man, Harlan Hartwell." "Only where it counts," he said. She took the appointment. The commission produced over the following 2 years a set of standardized guidelines for territorial surveys that were adopted by the Wyoming Land Office and referenced in federal land management documents for a generation. Annie Atwood Hartwell was listed as the primary author. She was 31 years old when the report was finalized. She came home from the last commission meeting in Cheyenne on a November Thursday, which was, she noted, the same day of the week she had first arrived at the ranch 7 years earlier. She came down the track and the ranch was visible from the rise, and it looked different every year because things were always being mended or added, but it also always looked itself. The old house with its good bones and the porch with its November decorations that Harlan had put up 3 days ago in her absence, cedar branches and rose hips and the wreath and the garland, and the lantern lit in the late afternoon. She stopped her horse at the top of the rise and looked at it. Then she rode down. Harlan was in the yard with William, who was nearly 8 now, and trying to help with something that required more height than he had, and Clara was on the porch watching through the railing with her serious eyes. Harlan looked up at the sound of hooves and saw her on the rise and then watched her come down with the same expression he had been unable to control that first time in the courthouse. Except now, he did not try to control it, because she knew what was in it and he had long since stopped seeing any reason to hide it. She dismounted, and William ran to her, and she caught him and swung him up in a way that made him shout with delight. And Clara came off the porch at a dignified 4-year-old pace and presented herself for a proper greeting, and Annie crouched down and greeted her with the full solemnity the occasion apparently required. Then she straightened and looked at Harlan over the children's heads, and the porch was behind him with its decorations and the lantern, and she said, "You did the rose hips." "Your method," he said, "the clusters. They look better this year," she said. "I had more practice," he said. She crossed to him through the yard, past the horses, and put her hand against his jaw and looked at him for a moment. "I am glad to be home," she said. He covered her hand with his. "I am glad you are home." She kissed him there in the yard, while William made the sound of a child who finds parental affection mildly undignified, and Clara watched with the eyes that were going to see everything. 3 more years went past, and each one was richer than the last. William started school in Copperton in 1895, riding the 4 miles on a small, steady pony that Harlan chose specifically for his temperament, and proved to be exceptional at mathematics, which surprised no one, and at drawing, which surprised everyone, and at arguing, which surprised no one at all. Clara, who started school 2 years after her brother, proved to be exceptional at reading and at a focused stubbornness that the teacher described as challenging and Annie described as essential and Harlan described as familiar. The Hartwell land grew in these years by a modest and carefully managed amount, a northern section that became available when a neighboring family moved east, which Harlan bought at a fair price because the fair price was available, and the land was good and the water rights were clear. Annie surveyed the new boundaries herself, which the sellers found satisfying and which Harlan found privately perfect. In the spring of 1897, they added the porch roof. This was a project Harlan had been thinking about for 2 years, because the original porch was open and the decorations suffered from heavy snow and rain, and a proper roof would mean the November arrangements would last through the winter. He designed it with Beaumont and built it over 3 weeks in May, good solid work with a slight pitch to shed the weather. And when it was done, Annie came out and looked at it and walked its length and looked out at the yard from under it and said, "It is very good. You can hang things from the rafters," he said. She looked up at the rafters, then at him, then back at the rafters. She was, by November, hanging dried lavender and sage from the rafters in bundles that scented the porch through the winter and were replenished in the spring. She had learned to grow the lavender in a kitchen garden she had started in 1893 as an experiment, expecting it to fail in the Wyoming climate and being pleasantly wrong about it, which she acknowledged directly and without embarrassment because being wrong about things you had honestly tested was simply information. The kitchen garden grew through the years into something substantial, a proper kitchen garden with its own logic and order, maintained by Annie when she was home and by Harlan and William and eventually Clara when she was away, each of them knowing the specific rules she had established for each plant, because she had explained them clearly enough that they were not forgettable. By 1898, the Hartwell Ranch was successful in the full sense of the word, not wealthy by the standards of the great ranches, but solid and debt-free and productive, with good water and good grass, and a reputation in Carbon County for being straight in its dealings that went back to Harlan's father and was being continued and extended. Harlan was 41 that year, in the strong good health of a man who has worked outdoors his whole life and had no particular vices. Annie was 35 and had, if anything, become more herself with each passing year. The certainty deepened into something that was also wisdom, the independence enriched by the choice to share it. On a November morning in 1898, 10 years after the first decorated porch, Harlan woke early and found Annie already up. She was standing at the kitchen window, holding her first coffee of the morning in both hands, looking out at the yard where the frost had come down hard in the night and made everything white and sharp. He came to stand beside her and she leaned against him without turning, which was her way, and they stood there looking at the land. "Tell me something," she said. "What?" "Tell me something you have never said before," she said. "Something true." He thought about it genuinely, the way she would want him to. "I think the best decision I ever made," he said slowly, "was not taking that porch apart before you could finish it, the morning after you first put it up. I went out very early and stood there for 10 minutes deciding, and I decided to leave it." She was still for a moment. "I did not know that," she said. "No," he said. "You were asleep." She turned to look at him then. 10 years and 2 children and the commission and the surveys and every morning at this table and every November porch, and she looked at him with the hazel eyes that had gone fully certain the way they did in the best light. "That was an excellent decision," she said. "I have made a few," he said. She smiled, the real one, the one that opened her face completely, and he thought about what he had said to the barn the night he had first realized he loved her, about not being sure whether to be furious or grateful that she had taken apart his careful management in 11 days. He knew the answer now. He had known it for years. He was grateful with the whole of himself, with the porch and the spring and the surveys and the children and the cedar knots tied in his mother's particular way, grateful with every November and every morning at this table, and every mile she had ever ridden home. "I need to check the markers on the east line today," she said, returning to her coffee. "The frost will make the ground readable. I want to see if there has been any movement since last spring." "I will ride out with you," he said. "Beaumont can manage the morning chores," she said. "Beaumont always manages the morning chores," he said. "I want to ride out with you." She looked at him sideways, the old look. "You are going to hold the post." "Tell me where you want it," he said. She smiled again and finished her coffee and went to get her coat and her notebook, and he got his own coat and his boots, and William appeared in the kitchen doorway, already dressed, alert at 12 in the way he was always alert. "Can I come?" William asked. Annie and Harlan looked at each other. "Get your coat," Annie said, "and bring the small notebook from my desk, the one with the red cover." William was gone and back in 45 seconds. The three of them rode out in the November morning, frost crunching under the horses' hooves, the mountains to the north clear and white against the cold blue sky, the land around them bright and still and entirely known, the east spring glinting silver in the low sun. William rode between his parents on the steady pony, the red notebook in his coat pocket, and he was already asking his mother what they were looking for, and she was already explaining it with full seriousness. And Harlan rode on her other side in the clean, cold air, and felt the morning press in on him from all sides, full of the specific weight of a life that had been built from what remained after everything burned, and built well, and built to last. The markers on the east line were exactly where they should be. Annie recorded the measurements, and William read the notebook entries back to her to confirm them. And Harlan held the post exactly as he had been shown the first time, with a careful and steady hand. And the frost on the grass caught the morning light and turned it briefly to something like fire, the warm, harmless, beautiful fire of a morning on a piece of land that knew exactly who it belonged to. They rode home in the late morning through country that was theirs, all three of them, under a sky so clear it seemed to go up forever. And the porch was decorated when they came into the yard, the rose hips red and the cedar green and the lantern ready for the evening, and the house behind it warm and full, and there was nothing missing from any of it, not a single thing.